Now maybe I think Kasit can bring us back a little bit, localize, regionalize it to here in Thailand, and I think Professor Perkins is a common dilemma in Southeast Asia among the ASEAN countries. You have China on the one hand, resident superpower. You have the incumbent United States, and some countries around here are concerned that we are being forced to choose between U.S. and China. Kasit.
Professor Perkins, I don't feel that I am competent because you are the guru of the guru. Usually I'm quite undaunted to be present and to give comment or to be on the panel and so on. But this time, for the first time, that I'm a bit in awe. Experiences, your wisdom and so on. It's like taking an examination. But an examination is okay because you write and then the professor look at it. So it's a one-to-one. But this time I'm exposed to the public at large. I will try it anyway to be a good student. But before I go to China, let me start with President Trump and the United States. Is that one question to you, Professor, that the United States is a very democratic country. The principle of check and balance, and everyone has a role to play. How come the way things are going in the United States is like the United States is an authoritarian state? How can President Trump do many things that doesn't seem to be logical? And he seems to have all the authorities when it comes to the international trade and international politics and so on. Couldn't there be more check and balance, and where are the brave politicians and the academic people and so on to tell him that is not the right cause? Okay, so I leave that to that one. But second point is very much to thank you profoundly for, I think, a very brief account of 70 years of economic development of China. From the past, the failure of Mao Zedong to the reform, drastic reform under Deng Xiaoping, to this very day. And I think we have a few students here, and I think 3 points to the student. First is the decision-making of the political leadership. I think we do know because they have the party congress every now and then. So one learns about the vision and the direction of China all along and so on. So the vision of the political leadership is very, very important. And the ICES Institute in Singapore just came out with the ASEAN survey. I was present about 10 days ago. And compared to the Chinese leadership, the collective ASEAN leadership of the 10 countries is something very much to be desired in order to make ASEAN, important, and the concept of centrality. So leadership is very important, and so far the Chinese leadership, for whatever that decision, to be more authoritarian or to be more liberal and so on, it was a decision and everyone knows. Second is that whatever you do politically and so on, it must be backed up by research activities. And I think Professor Perkins put the emphasis, and especially the joint cooperative activities between Harvard and the Chinese research. I think that's very important. That is part of the soft power that we hope to be able to see more and more, the interaction of the academic, the intellectual world of the two countries, in order to lessen this confrontational type of approach with this, I think, increasing day by day, because China would like to replace the United States. It's being said by President Xi and so on. But you cannot do away with the United States. So my second question to you is that, does the Chinese leadership know about the limitations of power? Whatever technology, whatever military what you call upgrading and so on, China would not be able to catch up to the United States. Why? Because the United States is an open country where the industry is the academic world, Yale and Harvard and Georgia Tech and so on, and the government do work together. But the Chinese system is very much under control of the party. And to the student, I think Professor Perkins did mention about a party committee. Let me expound a bit, because I did live in the Soviet Union for a couple of years. The party committee, it means that in every institution of China, beside the manager of a factory or the rector of the university, there is a set of people sent by the Chinese Communist Party to all of these internal institutions. So party do control every institution in China. So that is a reflection of totalitarian or whatever authoritarianism. But on top of that, I feel a bit more sinister. You know, maybe a bit, President Xi, he looks like his wife is an actress and so on. But the cyber security control, or the control of every citizen through the modern technology, is something quite frightening. And that is, I think, spill over into some of the ASEAN countries. At the moment, it's Laos, Cambodia, and Malaysia. And I think my government at the moment seems to be interested in the IT technology from China. So it means that we will be under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. I did write a couple of articles, I did give speech and so on, but it seems that my government and the political party do not take heed. It is not a simple thing to do whatever with China, because there is the political undertone, which means interference and trying to control your thought and so on. I just watch the television program every day. And then you see that about 6 or 7 actors and actresses and so on coming out to say how good is the technology of Huawei and so on, the G5. You know, so that is something that there is no awareness among the security and the intelligence and the political leadership of Thailand. Now, so the research is very important. The party committee is a control plus the technology and so on. So leave it to that. But my other comment, Professor, is that will the Chinese venture into the world through development assistance to FDI in the African continent, the networking of ports and airports in the Indian Ocean, building up parliaments and football stadiums and so on all over and so on, through the state enterprises. Would that have the return like what you have mentioned about, which everyone feel when we go to China, the excellent world-class infrastructure, much better than the United States. And then if you go back, if you drive from New York down to Washington, you thought that you are in the third world, the quality of the highway and so on. But that is not the case. But China so far has been overstretching. And at the same time, there is this domestic economic downturn. And one other point that you could mention also, Professor, the extent of corruption among the state enterprises. I think they are siphoning off the money and so on. And I think the Communist Party is closing one eye. Somehow, China is hurting itself through the state enterprise and so on. And then overspending militarily and all of this political economic venture abroad. Is that sustainable? Isn't there a feeling of limitation of the limit of power on the part of the Chinese leaders? Okay. The other point is that this wanting to be number one in the world if possible, but definitely in the Indo-Pacific region, is that a realistic wish? Or is it another dream other than madness on the part of a world leader, which we have seen throughout history, that you come to a point and then you want to do more, but you do not really analyze the internal capacity and the possibility of of it being sustainable and so on, all of these limitations. Then one last point, I think, because Dr. Thitinan would like me to say something about China-ASEAN community relations. I think I am not concerned about the Chinese wanting to interfere, to control, to create hegemony. I think the responsibility is in the hands of the 10 ASEAN leadership. And as long as they cannot come together in a room and speak very frankly, informally to one another that they have to get the act together, then ASEAN would not be strong. Then the concept of ASEAN centrality is a joke more than anything else. At the same time, the 6 original members of ASEAN must be able to tell the leadership of Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam that when they joined ASEAN in the 1990s, it's not for them to come and take away all the benefits or to use the name of ASEAN to get bilateral development system. They have the obligation to give to the ASEAN community also. And as long as we cannot get together, we will not be able to have a joint position of the 10 on the question of the South China Sea or on the utilization of the Mekong River. Today, I will have an article in the Now Na newspaper about the agreement on the Nile under the auspices of the US government and the World Bank. Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, developing country, much poorer than ASEAN collectively, now were able to come together and have an agreement on the management of the Nile. And we, the 5, cannot have a joint position to negotiate with the Chinese. At the same time, the Chinese have no determination or the magnanimity of the heart to stoop down and talk to us and have a proper arrangement for the whole of the Mekong Basin. So a few points here and there. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kasit. Just to let you know, I mean, we now around here, Professor Perkins is very concerned about, the usual conventional hotspots for security is the Korean Peninsula, the Taiwan, maybe Hong Kong, the South China Sea, but also for us it's the Mekong River and how it's being used in human rights. Yeah. Maybe you can react to his, answer a couple of questions about corruption in China. You didn't address that in your talk per se, but is it better? Is Xi Jinping-led corruption eradication, is it working? Has it enabled Xi Jinping to maintain some legitimacy by cracking down on corruption? And this second question about Ambassador Kasit raised about being overstretched. We see China everywhere now. This must be the unprecedented global reach that China is kind of aiming for everywhere in the world. The Belt and Road Initiative, and together with the debt diplomacy, so-called. So is it overreaching? Is it too much? And to what extent would China be satisfied with this global reach and global influence, or does it have to go all the way and supplant the U.S.?
Let me deal. I was fascinated by your perspective on this. Let me deal with some of the things. At least I think I know the answer to. And then the first one is, how is it that Trump can act like an authoritarian president? And the answer is that in 2 areas, the U.S. Congress has largely surrendered over time most of the power to do things to the president. And one of those areas is in the day-to-day management of trade. The actual trade agreements have to go through Congress. But if it's not a full treaty of some kind, in terms of tariffs, putting on tariffs, the Congress has essentially surrendered that power to the president. So the president has almost no constraints on how they implement existing trade policy. And that was done for years because the Congress was typically much more protectionist and more inclined to support local interests of various kinds. And so they wanted the president to basically be able to make an agreement that was sort of in the interest of the whole country, and they didn't want Congress trying to put all kinds of amendments in. And the difference is now Trump is just using it in a totally, he's the first president that really doesn't believe in free trade. He's not trying, and he's using it in a totally different way. On the foreign policy is the other, generally, in the use of the United States military, we've gotten into this policy of not having, Congress is now trying to reassert, we've got to have Congress vote on whether we go to war or not, which is, well, the answer is we never go to war, we just start fighting. And that, that obviously, if you're talking about a nuclear exchange, you need somebody who can push the button in a hurry if you want to destroy the whole world. But it has largely, they take some very narrow legal change, and again, it allows us to continue to do all kinds of things in the Middle East that we would undoubtedly be better off not doing. So that's a fairly straightforward. Congress, whether Congress will ever get back some of that power and whether they'll use it properly, who knows. Let me talk about the BRI and the whole sort of China as a aid giver. The Belt and Road Initiative the initiative is of course Xi Jinping's, but on the economic side, it was obviously a highly attractive way of using some massive excess capacity in the Chinese system. As China way overbuilt its steel industry and way overbuilt its cement industry during the big boom in the infrastructure. And it therefore had all these big construction permits. But you no longer have the justification, at least it's not efficient, to spend it all on more highways and more airports and more high-speed rail, although they're doing that. But you could use some of that capacity, and if you want to put the positive note on it, you can use that as a capacity to help a lot of other people. And in the process, create closer ties between China and Central Asia by getting them much more tied in, and whether that's appealing to the Russians or not is another matter. But you're getting, China needs the resources of Kazakhstan, it needs the resources of Siberia, probably can use them more efficiently than shipping them off to Europe and so on. So at one level it makes sense, but then of course, if you're going to do all this, maybe you could solve some Chinese security problems along the way. And the massive investment in Pakistan, for example, for that whole corridor down through Baluchistan of all places. So I was talking earlier before we got the first meeting I had in '74 when I was several hour meeting with Deng Xiaoping and the senator I was with. Deng was very worried about the breakup of Pakistan. My understanding, my limited understanding of Pakistan is, among other things, that Baluchis are not particularly thrilled at being part of Pakistan, and are not the most proper. So China's built this massive transport system through one of the most unstable parts of Pakistan, requiring very large military forces to defend it, but its strategic role in terms of the Middle East, in terms of energy supplies and so on, is fairly obvious. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the port in Myanmar. I mean, Myanmar could use a really good port, but it ought to be somewhere related to Yangon. This is in the Rakhine area, which is fine for bringing gas pipeline up through into Yunnan and so on. So it obviously, and then you the original deal that China made with Najib, and in fairness, the worst part of the deal was something that Najib did, but where they had this, I forgot now what the total figure was, but it was several $1 billion over what it should have cost. And when Mahathir came in, they renegotiated. And I've never totally figured out what the East-West Railroad was supposed to be for, but I've spent a lot of time in Malaysia, and I still spend a lot of time there working with various, both the government and private groups, universities, and so on. But I think, if you look at where they sort of placed a lot of their Southeast Asian investment, they clearly serve Chinese strategic purposes as well. Now, will that lead them to have friends all over the world? Because they get all of this, first place, China's mostly lending the money, which eventually has to be paid back. So it's not free grants. More important, China's learning what every other aid agency ever learned in doing this sort of work. You go in, and I mean, China started in places like Kenya by, you ship, they bring in lots of Chinese labor and lots of management and build a railroad or whatever it was they were building. And of course, the people locally resent it because not many of them are getting jobs. So China is good, learned now they're beginning to use local labor much more than they were. But has the U.S. gotten friends all over the world because we gave aid? We did. The Scandinavia rule the world because they actually generously give aid they're making some of the standard mistakes. They are correcting some of them, and if they potentially it could be a very positive thing, and it will obviously increase the power of China and influence if they are positive. But it's a bit early to tell. So far, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. We had a joint. I'm not very much involved in it, but we have a joint project at the Kennedy School that was working on BRI with China, and that is one of the things that, frankly, it's not clear whether that project will go forward because of what's sort of. I take your point. It would be wonderful if the universities in the U.S. and China could continue to cooperate the way they have over the last several decades. But this is in these kinds of areas, these politically sensitive areas, and this is particularly sensitive because of Xi Jinping's involvement. It seems to be research seems to be closing down. It's hard to have a real discussion. Is China going to be number one in the world, Pacific region? That depends on you. I don't think it depends. I don't think it depends primarily on the U.S. I'm familiar enough with Southeast Asia to know how diverse the interests of different Southeast Asian countries. I do lots of work in Vietnam. And of course, that's one that view, and the population of Vietnam, of course, is very hostile to major Chinese initiatives, the political leadership, a bit more of a mixed bag, but they have to ultimately go to the population. Then I could recite to you the Thai history, how you've managed to regain all these powers, but you know that far better than I do, so I don't really have a good answer.
The IC's survey, Professor Perkins, they asked Southeast Asia think tanks and so on, the analysts and researchers about US and China. So the three countries that are more critical of China is Philippines, Vietnam, and Singapore. And then the others are mixed, of course, are more very pro-China, as Cambodia, Laos, and Brunei. The floor now is open. I'll invite questions, comments. We have half an hour.
Just one question. One of the reasons why China is expanding is the concept of harmonious society. However, to build a harmonious and well-off society, the concept of humankind should always be pursued. So the question is it too early for China, who is suffering from serious wealth gap and significant urban and rural disparity, to propose and strive for that concept? I would just like to ask for your thoughts because, so in the Philippines, we're receiving significant amount of development assistance because of that concept of harmonious relationship. However, there are people who are expressing their negative opinion about it.
Sorry, can you speak closer to the microphone, please, and reset the last time? Okay. Closer to the microphone, please.
Okay, thank you. May I ask for your thoughts on is it too early for China with a serious wealth gap and urban-rural disparity to propose and strive for the concept of harmonious society? Because in the Philippines, we're receiving a lot of development assistance because of their promotion of harmonious society. So, we would just like to ask for your opinion if it's too early for them to strive for that concept.
At one level, you don't. China or the U.S. doesn't have to solve all of its own domestic problems in order to be helpful somewhere else. It's sort of like when you're a parent with a child. You say, "Do as I say," instead of as I do. You can make a contribution without necessarily having solved the problem yourself. In fact, so in terms of the rural urban divide, China has had a very serious problem with the household registration system, the so-called hukou system, where that has created a two-class of citizens in the country. That is gradually breaking down. They're gradually getting rid of it, and making it easier and easier to register as an urban resident. But that difference was a major source, and even the harmonious society term was used actually in the previous government, Hu Jintao government, and they made a little progress in that regard. China's done a lot of things to help the rural areas and to raise rural incomes, and I've been in some of the very poor areas of China, in Qinghai and Guizhou and Gansu and so on. And there's no question that there's been an enormous progress in it. Whether China can help the Philippines or anybody else in that regard, if they give aid let me put it down. Aid is effective when the country that receives it knows why it wants it and knows how to use it. China cannot go in, and neither can the U.S., and say, here's what you should, or the World Bank, here's what you should be doing. If the government does not itself have a strategy and that it's carrying out, I ran something called the Harvard Institute for International Development for a long time. We had development projects all over Asia and Africa. One of the good things about many of the Asian countries is they did have a domestic strategy that the aid could go into. So when you worked with Professor Wijoyo in Indonesia or whatever, you knew whatever you were going to do in aid, it was going to fit into his vision of what was the right way to go. If you don't have that, and much in our experiences in Africa meant that you often the countries often did not have a clear vision of what they wanted, and therefore it was not, frankly, it was often not very effective. The aid agencies basically had their own agendas, and they tried to, and they often were in conflict. I could go on and lengthen this, but I'm not going to, because it's pretty far off the topic right now.
My question is, in September, ASEAN and China signed the ASEAN BRI Master Plan, if I'm not mistaken, in September here in Thailand. And a few of my colleagues told me that it was actually showing how China is really close with the ASEAN member states. But however, just recently, China provoked the Indonesians at North Natuna Sea, in which its ships are actually having confrontation with our fishing vessels. My question is, why did China provoke ASEAN states, even though China is actually needing ASEAN states to advance its economic interest in the region, in Southeast Asia? Thank you.
I've puzzled for a long time why China has decided to push so hard on particularly on the fortified islands in the South China Sea, but also in this fairly vigorous assertion of rights over some highly improbable areas. I mean, I happen to, as I said, we've done a lot of work in Vietnam, and we have a school there and so on. The Chinese planes go right over the Vietnamese continental shelf up close. I mean, the 9-dash line has no historical value, and why it appeals. I mean, it obviously appeals to a certain nationalistic sense in China. And if you basically take it in the Chinese history context of, 100 years of humiliation and so on by the Western imperialist powers, you can say, okay, this is a reaction to that, that China is showing that it can do what it wants and in its interest. But why they picked this, because ultimately, it doesn't, I don't think the islands in the South China Sea increase their security much at all. They would be easily destroyed in a war. And why then they bring in their own, it would be so much cheaper to negotiate over how you develop offshore oil and so on in this area than to try to do it in a fairly, but it gets somehow into this psychological thing, and maybe the political advantages domestically of being asserted, but you'll have to ask Xi Jinping and others why they picked this particular. I really don't know.
Can I help to answer? Let me cite a couple of examples. The Mekong development, or the Lan-Chang Mekong development cooperation. I think the Chinese leadership approach is, from what I have been following, is that to give the carrots, with development assistance. And in the case of Indonesia, the Chinese leadership is ready to invest in the overall infrastructure development of the Java Island, railroads and things like this and so on. So that's the carrot part of it. Then at the same time, they hope that they could neutralize the wish of the other 5 riparian states of Mekong not to question the utilization of the water upstream of the Mekong to build another 11 dams. That's one. South China Sea, similarly, I mean, they give a lot of development assistance to the Philippines government and so on in order to neutralize the what they call the bilateral claimants of the overlapping sea area. And so it's that type of approach that not only undermine ASEAN as a whole, but they also venture to try to get control of the respective ASEAN leaderships. And I think that is some sort of a corruption in the picture also. So this is something that Indonesian government or inside the Indonesian, you have to sit down. And that would you go for the exchange of the economic development for the whole of the Java Island, and then to close one eye on the encroachment in the Natuna Sea. That applies to the rest of the ASEAN country. But unless and until the 10 ASEAN get together and say that development assistance is fine, BRI is fine, but it doesn't give the Chinese authority the right to do whatever it wants unilaterally in the South China Sea, inclusive of the Natuna Sea or in the Mekong or across the Taiwan Strait and so on. But so far there has not been that political discussion in an open manner and to come out with a united front, one joint position of ASEAN. I think that is needed. Thank you.
So first of all, I would like to thank the speakers for their perspectives and their insights.
Please tell us your name.
Andres Rincon from the Colombian Embassy. And I was just wondering if Professor Perkins, just moving to a different region of the world, could share his perspectives and views on the increased presence of China in Latin America in terms of the commerce of commodities and also mining activities and extraction of minerals.
My knowledge is of the Chinese investments in Latin America is, to put it mildly, not profound. I've had a couple of students doing papers on it and so on. My general view, I mean, one, China needs natural resources. They're short. And so it's a perfectly legitimate thing for China to want to acquire sources, reliable sources of various natural resources, and Latin America is one major area where some of those are. So by itself, fine. There's nothing about that. Then the question is, how do you go about doing that, and how do you make that into a I mean, given the size of Chinese economy, it's inevitably and they certainly have a perfectly right to continue growing and having higher per capita income, and that's going to require buying a lot more tin and a lot more, whatever, soybeans and so on. And if it's done in a pretty straight commercial way, it's probably, it's ultimately going to be beneficial to everyone. Now, the Chinese do have some notion that ownership is going to make their or some sort of direct control of it more reliable source. I'm frankly somewhat skeptical of that. I don't know. I mean, you could tell me, is the U.S. more secure because Exxon has owned some shares or whoever it is in the United States owns shares in Aramco? I don't know. I mean, the oil is going to become available anyway. The Saudis can't use it; they have to sell it. And Chile isn't going to use all the tin. So I think normal trading should be perfectly adequate, and ownership But China has certainly done an effort. I mean, in Africa in particular, for example, they've gone into some of the more dubious governments and made arrangements partly because the U.S. and the UK and others already can have those arrangements with the more reputable countries in Africa. But so my feeling is if it helps Latin America, and on the other hand, if it's abused in some way, then it's up to Latin America to deal with it. That's not a very good answer, but.
I've been in the manufacturing sector in Thailand for about 20 years, originally from Australia. And I just wanted to pose a question. You've got deep experience with China and Chinese culture. Given that the 20th century saw massive failures in authoritarian regimes, Nazi Germany, the communists after them, and also the reign of Chairman Mao in China, and also, I mean, obviously resulting in the deaths of millions of people. Why does communism still have legs? Why is the cat still out of the bag, in a sense, from a Chinese perspective? Why is it still considered as, whether it be Marxist theology or just having complete control over people's lives, when we've got so many examples of the fact that freedom is actually a much preferred way of living and in business, a way of doing business as well.
CCP still has legs, but beyond that even, I think it even has more influence around the region and beyond. I mean, you have more authoritarian regimes and shades of authoritarianism in many countries now than before.
Yeah, that's a question I ask myself, and I don't, answering it, I mean, asking it's not so hard, but answering it, I mean, in the early stages, you know, if you're talking about the 50s, you know, then it's easy. They unified China, they brought stability to China, and then over time, they created a strong, I mean, they made a mess of things from 58 to 76, but then, you know, for 40 years, they've done an awful lot of things right. People are a whole lot better off, I mean, big time better off than they were. And furthermore, they had far more freedom than they'd ever had. And so I think, you know, the credibility of the Communist Party, particularly under the Deng Xiaoping era, was really pretty high. I think that, you know, they actually have done a few surveys of people in China and you know, there's a lot of resentment about local cadres and so on, but on the whole, the national government still has a pretty decent reputation among them. But obviously, the national government seems to be losing its self-confidence that it can rely on that, and instead has to rely on the cyber security and increasing authoritarian and thought control and things like that. And that obviously, I think, reflects some of their own, you know, their insecurity more than, because they spent a lot of time studying what happened in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is easy. I mean, that was imposed by the Soviet Army, and it was never. But why the Soviet Union broke up, and Mr. Putin is still trying to figure out a way to recreate some piece of the Soviet Union, but if it's done entirely with this massive high technology, I don't. My own feeling is over time what happens with that is that a lot of the people who don't like it end up being the leaders, because they ultimately become extremely vulnerable. And that essentially, I mean, Stalin terrorized everybody, including all of his colleagues. And they ultimately, when he died, they began to fundamentally change the system. And they ended up with Gorbachev. And China is horrified that they may end up with Gorbachev. And with Zhao Ziyang, they feel they may have actually been close to that. If Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang had stayed in power, you might have gotten actually some political reform. But that's long past now. But I'm afraid I don't see any serious resistance within China to this at this stage. What will happen 10, 20, or 30 years from now, I don't know. Yeah, there's serious reasons. I mean, there are a lot of academics that are unhappy too. I mean, there are a lot of intellectuals that I think are going to be very unhappy with this. Some are very strongly nationalistic and they like what's going on, but a lot of them are not. So yeah, there are a lot of, but none of them have real power. Hong Kong has no power. I'm scared. I'm awful worried that what Hong Kong is going to achieve is basically just the end of what they at least have to some degree still, and will for another 20 years if the system continues. But even that may not continue. Intellectuals, unfortunately, are not at least in the short run, terribly powerful in the Chinese context.
And at the end of the Soviet Union. And I think the Chinese leadership did study the failure of Gorbachev, that in introducing Glasnost and Perestroika and so on, he did away with the Communist Party of Russia, of the Soviet. So he had nobody to link up and to control. And the Chinese leadership, having seen the failure of the Soviet transformation, retain the Communist Party, so to have a body to run and gradually introduce the economic system. And it has been successful the 30 years over the opening up by, I think, late 1970. So China has to tell itself and the people, because of the Communist Party, that's why we elevated the poverty and things like this. Now we become the number 2. But the success is not only that, they have been exporting this to the Thai, to the Cambodia, the Laotian leadership and so on, retain the authoritarian nature of the political structure in combination with capitalist market. And whether you take that or not, it's okay, up to the leadership of the people.
Seems to me that at the moment, China needs, ASEAN needs China more than China needs ASEAN. So that's why at the moment we see something like the relationship is lopsided. In other words, we depend too much on China. For example, in terms of tourism of Thailand, Chinese tourists accounted for like 1/4 of the foreign travelers to Thailand, which are like 10 or 11 million out of 40 million last year. So my question is, how would we create leverage, or what are the leverage for ASEAN or for each individual countries of ASEAN in dealing with superpowers? If we don't have that, at the moment it seems that ASEAN is fighting or competing with each other. For example, in terms of tourism again, last 2 weeks, the Malaysian came out with very strong measures to lift the visa for a year for China and Chinese and Indian travelers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Question about leverage and the last one.
In your role as a China watcher, whether you had any observations of notable trends or developments in Chinese espionage capabilities over the years? Thank you.
The first one about kind of Chinese buying condos here, so maybe a question about equality, inequality, and then how to build leverage in ASEAN and Southeast Asia collectively and also individually. And then the Chinese influence operations, espionage, cyber influence.
Okay, those are all three big and somewhat distinct questions. First, on the shock therapy, who did the best? One, China didn't use shock therapy for the most part. It was much more gradual, and it was obviously, it was pretty, I don't think you can describe what has happened over the last 40 years as anything but very successful. I mean, there are lots of particular problems, but it's an enormous economic success, and the Eastern Europe paid a price by doing it all in a hurry. And I had colleagues and friends, and even our institute to some degree involved in the shock theory, but it was somewhat naive. It was a group of macroeconomists, the advisors at least from outside, were macroeconomists who think that all of these micro things automatically occur and that people will automatically learn how to operate in a market economy after managing within a centrally planned economy and so on. On the condo issue and why is, I think basically there are restrictions and limits on how Chinese who have wealth can invest their money. And so they invest a lot in condos in China, including some that stay empty, because the stock market is really a roulette wheel type operation. That's true of most countries in the early stages of stock markets. And it's not that easy to invest abroad unless you're a big time operator. And so why the only other additional consideration why they would invest in condos in Thailand is, well, it's out of reach of the Chinese Communist Party. So anyway, and there's a lot of that going on. I mean, I could get into real estate investment in the U.S. and Canada, but anyway. ASEAN needs China. I mean, how does ASEAN deal with superpowers? First place, when you have a big economy next to you, a huge economy like China, you're going to have a lot of trade. You're going to have a lot of tourism. You're going to have for the most part, I mean, if it's managed properly, it's a good thing. And then it's up to you to figure out how to manage it. But I think would China like the U.S. to be totally gone from Southeast Asia? And the answer is yes. Will the U.S. go from, certainly not voluntarily. And the U.S. is a big economy, and Europe is a big economy, and so you have a lot of other relationships. So a lot of it seems to me is fairly straightforward. You manage it. And the question is when one of the countries tries to throw its weight around too much, how do you resist that? And I don't know. I guess I'd say the way to do that is to figure out how Thai managed to deal with the British and the French for Thailand for 100 years, and maybe figure out some version of how to deal with the U.S. and China. But that's a little bit superficial, but to put it mildly. But I reckon it is the big challenge you have in foreign policy for the next 20 or 30 years. But in terms of how you relate to all this. Chinese espionage. everybody does this. You know, all countries that have any substantial international involvement do espionage. The Chinese espionage in the United States at the moment is getting a lot of publicity. It's a bit more complicated in the U.S. because young Chinese who come to universities in the United States, which, you know, in the hundreds of thousands, you know, a lot of the major universities, a lot of the major engineering and science departments would be in real trouble without Chinese students. There are not enough Americans to keep a lot of these departments going. So you know, they gain. They're supposed to learn a lot of technology. They do learn a lot of technology, and some of them then, you know, because the U.S. is an immigrant society, a lot of them stay in the U.S. and become good citizens and do lots of good things. And then there are a few that don't. A few that use it as an opportunity for espionage, and then they send individual people over. The U.S. my impression is the U.S. has never been very effective in terms of human espionage in China. Most everybody gets caught and thrown in jail pretty quickly, I think. In the U.S., maybe it's more successful. The U.S. espionage largely relies on other methods, but you know, you know, the way you deal with espionage is you have a good state security that doesn't undermine your own human rights. It basically protects you the best it can, and the U.S. does a reasonable job anyway, I think. So I don't think the alternative is not to have anything worth stealing, and you don't have to worry about it. That's also a very superficial statement.
In just 1 minute of closing, I'll just say this, Professor Perkins, if I may. Despite having studied China for 7 decades, right, 70 years, longer than almost all of us here in this room have lived, you know, you've said, I think I counted a number of times, maybe close to 10. You said, "I don't know," which is remarkable. It tells us a number of things. First, that, you know, there's a limit to what we can know. I think also, of course, your modesty. But nevertheless, you know, what you've given us today is very rich, very deep, and nuanced. So for the students who are here, you know, they want to have kind of takeaways. They want to go back with something. So if we were to look at growth prospects, we probably would say China is probably have slower growth. You know, slower growth. You mentioned 6% possible still within this decade, but it will be slower growth as the income rises. And then domestic politics, you mentioned, I think, insecurity, you know, maybe conservative, maybe the nationalistic a little bit. Geostrategy, what you said, you know, part of the don't knows is that sometimes you just, like the South China Sea, you have to go ask Xi Jinping why they're doing that, because it doesn't make sense to you. So overall, Professor Perkins, thank you very much. And I also want to thank your wife, Julie Perkins, you know, for visiting Thailand, but also taking time off your schedule to speak to us. You have a final?
Not knowing my father, who was an architect, he had his favorite cartoon. And the cartoon was this huge elephant, which was China. And down was a little doctor with a stethoscope on the toenail of the elephant. And the little doctor was labeled China specialist. Anyway.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Perkins. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone. Thank you.